Hello, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Cipher, a Forest's cat burglar and debuffer that records steam damage to power up her ult to deal big PP damage. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, Lightcones, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the creator experience server, so some things could still change when her banner drops. Let's start with her talent, because her entire kit and playstyle pretty much revolves around it. First, it allows her ult or skill to inflict the Patron state on an enemy, and whenever an ally hits the Patron, Cipher launches a follow-up against it. Just note, this follow-up can only be triggered once, with its trigger count resetting at the start of Cipher's turn. Now, if there aren't any enemies under the Patron state, Cipher will immediately inflict Patron on the enemy with the highest max HP. Just note, there can only be one Patron at a time, but you can change who the patron is by using her skill or ult. Now, her talent also records 12% of all damage dealt to the patron, which is indicated by this gold tally next to Cipher. But the neat thing is, she has two additional abilities that buff her damage recording potential. Her A2 allows her to record 8% of any non-true or overflow damage dealt to a non-patron target, basically allowing any attack to any target to contribute to the damage tally. But the crazy thing is, her A4 buffs her crit rate and damage recording efficiency massively based on her speed. If she has 140 speed, she gains 20% crit rate and buffs the recorded value by 50%. But if she has 170 speed, she gains 50% crit rate and buffs the recorded value by 100% instead. Meaning in total, she'll record up to 24% of the damage dealt to the patrons, or up to 16% of the damage to non-patrons, which is basically double the original amount. So for example, if you deal 1000 damage each to 5 enemies for a total of 5000 damage, you'll end up recording 240 from the patron and 160 from the other goons, for a total of 880 damage or 17.6% of the total AoE. Just note, she can't record through or overflow damage cause it would be too OP otherwise. So the max damage you can record per enemy is equal to 24% of their health bar, meaning E6 DPSs that deal more than 2 times the boss's health bar will have the same max damage recorded as an E0 DPS. And just note, her ult does fully clear the recorded damage tally, so be careful not to use it in the wrong time, like at the end of a boss phase. But speaking of which, let's move on to her ult, yours truly, Kitty Phantom Thief, which relies a lot on her recorded damage. Now her ult is a two-part attack. The first part is a 2-hit single target attack, with the second hit dealing true damage equal to 25% of the damage recorded. While the second part is a 2-hit blast attack, with the second hit dealing true damage equal to 75% of the damage recorded, which is distributed equally among all targets. So how this works is that in a scenario with 3 enemies, her ult will deal 50% of the total damage tally as true damage to the main target of the ult, while dealing 25% to the enemies beside it. While with 2 enemies, it will deal 62.5 to the main target and 37.5 to the enemies beside it. But here's where it becomes insane. If you use it on a lone enemy, it essentially just dumps 100% of the tally as true damage on the main target, allowing for some good nuking potential. But the neat thing is, you can save her recorded damage just by not using her ult. And there are a few scenarios you wanna do it in order to make more effective use of it. First is if a boss has multiple goons. In some cases, it's much better to kill the goons first before ulting in order to get as much damage on the boss as possible and to avoid wasting recorded damage. Second, if a character is reliant on a certain ability that takes a while to ramp up, like Acheron, Fishao, or Herta, it's much better to save her ult for these characters' downtimes in order to keep high damage going while building their abilities. And finally, for boss phases, if the boss's HP is pretty low, it's much better to save her ult until the next phase to avoid wasting damage. And cause true damage ignores any effects, it also ignores any damage mitigation mechanics a boss may have at the start of a phase, meaning you can deal the full amount of the tally, allowing you to nuke the boss's next phase into oblivion, no problem. Now let's move on to her goofy looking skill, a jackpot for the taking. It's just a blast attack that does 2 things. First of all, it buffs her attack by 30% for 2 turns, and finally, it reduces the damage dealt by an enemy by 10% also for 2 turns. Just note, each use of the skill does reapply these effects. Not only does its attack buff help with her overall damage output, it also helps a bit with team survivability, especially in zero sustain teams, which Cipher appreciates a lot since she is pretty squishy, which Flame Reaver can attest to. It's also worth noting that without her signature, if you plan to run her with Acheron, this is where most of her debuffs come from. Now for her technique. First, it makes her undetectable by overworld enemies for 15 seconds, while increasing her movement speed by 50%, perfect for traversal. But the neat thing is, it also has a chance of giving you a consumable whenever you go near an enemy, giving you up to 50 items in a single real-life day. Let's go petty theft! But while in battle, Cipher immediately deals quantum damage equaling to 100% of her attack, and records 200% of its damage for her tally. And finally, her last additional ability, it increases her follow-up attack's crit damage by 100%, while permanently increasing the damage taken by all enemies by 40% just by having Cipher exist. This essentially is a better 3B ult, with it resulting in a 10% more damage increase compared to the 30% from 3B's ult. And the neat thing is, unlike any other buffer or debuffer, you won't have to worry about its downtime as long as Cipher is alive. For ability prio, I recommend leveling her talent first, then her skill, then her ult, and finally her basics. Just note the reason her ult isn't high in leveling priority is because most of its damage comes from recorded damage, which does not get affected by her ult's level because leveling her ult only upgrades its non-true damage multipliers. With her kit out of the way, we can talk about her Eidolons. Her E1 increases Cipher's recorded damage by 150% of its original recorded value, and her follow-up now gives her an 80% attack buff for 2 turns, which is essentially just more damage for Cipher. Now, the recorded damage may seem big on paper, but because it's applied after the original damage was recorded, it's actually a bit smaller than it seems. For example, if you deal 100k, Cipher will record 24k at E0, but at E1, she will add 50% more to the count and record 36k instead, which is still pretty good for a damage increase. But I suggest going for her S1 instead of her E1 since it does provide more utility, while her E2 gives her attacks a 120 base chance to inflict a 30% damage vulnerability debuff for 2 turns to any target she hits. There are 2 neat things about the skill. First, it stacks with her A6, allowing her to give up to a 70% damage vulnerability debuff. And second, it gives her a similar utility for her S1 in Acheron teams, allowing her basics and follow-ups to now inflict debuffs, which is good for charging Acheron's ult. As for her E4, every time a patron is attacked by an ally, Cipher will deal additional damage to it equal to 50% of her attack, which again is just more Cipher damage. And finally, her E6 increases the damage dealt by Cipher's follow-ups by 350%, while recording an additional 16% more damage from this attack. And it also refunds 20% of the recorded damage tally after using her ult instead of completely clearing it. Now that huge follow-up buff turns her into a mini follow-up DPS, adding another nuke-like attack into her kit. But the more important part is that Cipher will now record a total of 40% damage from her follow-ups, while making her ult deal more consistent damage due to its damage tally refund. With her Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about Lightcones. Cipher's gorgeous signature increases her speed by 18%, and whenever she attacks, there's a 120 base chance she'll inflict Bamboozle on every enemy, which reduces their defense by 16%. But if Cipher has at least 170 speed, she also inflicts Theft, which reduces their defense by an additional 8%. This cone makes it so that her basics and follow-ups can now inflict refreshable debuffs, which helps battery Acheron, while also making her a bit more SP positive in Acheron teams since he won't be as reliant on her skills to apply debuffs. Not only does it provide an 18% speed buff, which is rare for Nihility Lightcones, it also gives up to a 24% defense shred for 2 turns. So unlike the Resolution Lightcone, you won't have to worry about the enemies cleansing their defense shred by taking a turn in between her and your DPS. A decent alternative is Resolution, with it applying a defense shred every time she hits an enemy, but it does have a few caveats. First is uptime. This is because the buff only lasts for 1 turn, meaning the debuff can be used up if an enemy takes a turn before her DPS, which can happen due to her high speed. Second, you can't reapply this cone's debuff if it's still active on an enemy, which means it has weaker battery potential for Acheron compared to her signature. But despite all of this, it's still a good option for its utility. Kafka's signature also works with it giving speed while also buffing her damage massively. and it also allows her follow-ups and basics to apply a debuff for Acheron. But the problem is, just like Resolution, its debuff is not reapplyable, and it has a weaker support utility since it just gives a DOT. While Silverwolf's signature is a good effect hit rate stat stick, it also happens to buff her crit rate, and it also allows her basics, skill, or ult to also inflict a 12% damage vulnerability debuff. Its only downside is that its uptime is similar to Resolution, so it has the same problem of enemies cleansing buffs by taking turns between her and her DPS. But with her Lightcones out of the way, let's look at possible relics. If you're having trouble getting to 170 speed, her best choice would be a 2-2 speed combo of any speed boosting set. This setup is especially helpful if you don't plan to roll for her signature, since there's not a lot of speed Nihility Lightcones. But if you're having no trouble getting to 170 speed, Genius for its Def Ignore and Quantum Damage buff, or Pioneer for its damage and crit buffs are good damage boosting options. Just note, these two get so much better if you have her signature, because Pioneer appreciates its more consistent debuffs, while Genius benefits from its defense shred. As for planar sets, for a more supportive option, you can use Lushaka, Fleet, Penacony, and even Broken Keel to help buff your DPS's performance. With Penacony being good if you plan to run her with a quantum DPS like Castaries, while the others are just good general use options. As for more damage-oriented options, you can use Glamoff, Duran, or Izumo, with Duran being a good option for follow-up and crit damage buffs in follow-up teams, Izumo being good for its bonus crit and attack in Acheron teams, while Glamoff being a good general use damage option since you can easily get its damage buff with you building Cipher for 170 speed anyway. With her possible sets out of the way, let's talk about stats. Looking at all her stats and traces, she has an extremely low base HP of 931, making her super squishy, a decent base attack of 640, and a pretty good base speed of 106. With her traces giving her 14 speed, 10 effect hit rate, and 14.4 bonus quantum damage and 50% crit rate. So make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, you want a crit chest, speed boots, an ER or attack rope, and a quantum orb. You can use an ER rope if you want to use her ult more often, but an attack rope is generally preferred since you want to be timing her ult anyway. Now for the chest, crit damage is preferred because she does get a lot of crit rate. But you can still use a crit rate chest just so you have one less substat to worry about. As for substats, you want to focus on speed first, then crit damage, then crit rate, then attack percent, and effect hit rate. Just make sure not to overcap with crit rate since she does get 50% from her trace. And I recommend getting 40% effect hit rate since it'll pretty much guarantee the debuffs from her skill and signature will land on any enemy. But you can get away with lower due to her multi-hit skill. But aside from this, she needs 170 speed to activate her trace, otherwise her damage drops off by a lot. Thankfully, it's not too hard to achieve this. For example, with just her base speed, traces, and speed boots alone, she already has 145 speed. And if you decide to run a 2-piece speed combo, this goes up to 157 speed without her signature and 176 speed with her signature. And with non-speed boosting sets with the same setup, you'll get 164 speed with her signature. So as you can see in her best setups, she'll only need a few speed substats to reach 170. But with her build out of the way, let's move on to possible teammates. Now with her high speed, damage recording mechanic, offensive abilities, and every unit benefiting from her permanent damage vulnerability debuff, you can pretty much use her in any team where you would usually slot a Pella or Tribi, which makes her a pretty universal high attack frequency sub DPS with a useful damage amp and pretty fast debuff application rate. You can run her in HP scaling teams like Castaries, Blade or Mighty Comps if you don't have Tribi or Rowanbe, and she'd be able to buff their damage while dealing good damage herself. Any attack or crit scaling team will also benefit from Cypher's debuffs and sub DPS capabilities. You can run her with King Yuan, a main DPS Anaxa, Aglaya, and even follow-up comps if you happen to be missing a support for them. Heck, you can even run her in DOT or break teams if you happen to not have their best supports. And she'll be able to deal good damage in these comps while still effectively buffing and recording the team's damage. But a notable DPS you can run with her is Fei Xiao, with Cypher's high attack and turn frequency, giving lots of flying Aureus charge for Fei Xiao's ult, while also buffing overall team damage with her damage vulnerability debuff. Now she's a good alternative to 3B, Rowanmei, or Robin for this team if you don't have them. But she can also take the place of March, Topaz, or Moza as her sub-DPS, plus Cypher's ult and other offensive abilities can also make up for lost damage while charging Fei Xiao's ult. Another notable DPS you can run with her is the Herta. Same with Fei Xiao, Cypher's high attack and turn frequency gives lots of energy to help charge Herta's ult, all while also buffing overall team damage with her damage vulnerability, which Herta appreciates due to her teams being duo DPS comps. And she does all of this while being able to deal good single or blast damage, which is something not a lot of Herta supports can do, which of course allows her to keep damage going during Herta's downtime. Now, she will take the spot of the support in Herta teams, with her being an alternative to 3B or Robin. Now, 3B is still preferred in 5 enemy fights. This is due to her AoEs being able to generate more energy for Herta in that scenario. But for fights with less enemies, Cypher will generate enough Herta energy to be comparable to 3B due to her high turn and attack frequency, while also boosting the team's overall damage due to her sub-DPS capabilities. And finally, she also works super well with Acheron. Just like Herta and Fei Xiao, Cypher's high attack and turn frequency charges Acheron's ult super fast by providing a lot of debuffs, which she does while also buffing the team's overall damage output with her damage vulnerability. And the setup gets even better if you have Cypher's signature, essentially allowing her follow-ups and basics to also provide debuffs, which not only charges Acheron's ult faster, but also makes Cypher a bit more SP positive since she won't have to rely as much on her skills for debuff application. Plus, she can also use her ult during Acheron's downtimes to keep high damage going. Now, there are 2 ways you can run Cypher and Acheron teams. First is an alternative to Jiaoqiu in a triple Nihility or hyper carry setup with another support like 3B or Robin. And the second is running both Jiaoqiu and Cypher together, and either way you decide to do so, this team should still perform pretty well. But if you're wondering who's better, Cypher or Jiaoqiu, well, honestly, I think it's pretty even. Both have pretty good debuff application rates, but Jiaoqiu's is still a bit better if you plan to run Acheron in Pure Fiction and has a more consistent debuff application at S0. But with S1, Cypher does take the edge since her debuff application becomes more consistent due to her high speed and basic into follow-up combo, now giving 2 charges for Acheron. But because of this, it could be argued that she's more reliant on her signature compared to Jiaoqiu, making her a bit more expensive. They both have high uptime damage vulnerability debuffs, so even at S0, they can both buff the team's damage no problem. But where Cypher takes the crown is her damage output, with her offensive and nuking capabilities being able to significantly make up for any damage loss during Acheron's downtime, which results in higher team damage output and potentially faster clears. So despite both being good at enabling Acheron's damage, I personally prefer Cypher just because of her damage recording mechanics alone. However, if you're an Acheron main, don't be too pressured into rolling for Cypher because Jiaoqiu is still an extremely good support for Acheron. And like I said, you can always run them together, so having both isn't really bad. But that's about it because I'm beginning to lose my voice. But there's just one last question. Is she a must-pull? As usual, it depends on the state of your account. She's not really a must-pull if you already have good supports like 3B or Jiaoqiu and are satisfied in their performance in their respective teams. In this case, it's so much better to roll for characters you want or ones that can benefit your account more. There's also the case of Silver Wolf getting buffed next patch. So if you have her, it might be a good idea to wait until they reveal her buffs in next week's livestream before you pull for Cypher. But with Phynon and the Fate collab coming next patch, it might not be a bad idea to start saving your Jades either. Remember, Cypher will always have a rerun, but you can't say the same about Arthur and her and Emiya's Lightcones. However, she is a must-pull if you need a good sub-DPS with damage amplification capabilities. Not only is she able to buff her teammates' damage massively with her damage vulnerability debuff and S1, she's also able to deal extremely high damage thanks to her damage recording mechanic, allowing you to nuke enemies. But the most important part about her is how universal she is. She can pretty much fit in most teams, making her a very versatile unit. And because of how universal she is, she'll definitely have a longer shelf life compared to other units. But at the end of the day though, if you like Cypher, pull for her, and if you don't, well don't. Personally, I'm gonna be rolling for her just because I like her design and character so much. Because of reasons. Definitely not because she's an adorable cat girl. But make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcases. Hopefully you enjoy, and please forgive my skill issue, I'm actually terrible at this game.